Does this work?
Does this work?
Yeah, I think it does.
Does this work? Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, I think it does.
Ooh, I can hear myself 3 times.
Yeah, I think it does. Ooh, I can hear myself 3 times. Ooh, I
You can hear that?
3 times. You can hear that?
All right. Gonna have some bubbles.
All right.
Bubbles.
Gonna have some bubbles. Bubbles. Gonna have some bubbles.
Okay.
Bubbles.
It's almost Christmas. It's been a long semester, so I can be a bit silly.
It's almost Christmas. It's been a long semester, so I can be a bit silly. It's almost Christmas. It's been a long semester, so I can be a bit silly. It's almost Christmas.
Wow, I can hear myself 4 times.
Wow, I can hear myself 4 times. Wow, I can hear myself 4 times.
Okay. Okay, so I just, I'm not sure what happened. Okay, I see MA. Hi, Professor. Okay, great. So I can see someone. Maybe there were some connection issues or something else happened, but whatever the reason is, I'm here now and I can see there are at least 5 of you. So the link should be working now. And I sent out the new link via email on Moodle, so hopefully more of our classmates will see it too, because I don't want to just talk to myself all night, because I do that enough as it is. Okay. All right, so dance party. Ooh, a dream. This one's nice. This would be especially appropriate if I were talking about Freud or Lacan or something like that. Okay. Okay. There's glamour. What's that? It's about the same thing. Beam. High contrast. Oh, I love this. 8mm. It's like an old documentary. Okay. Okay, so, all right, so let me know if you guys can see this. I saw one of you said hi. Let me know if you are watching, if you're listening. Okay. Great, I see MA. MA, hi Professor, hi MA. Okay, let's see if there's anyone else. I'm just gonna walk around. Okay, Ula, okay, great. Shema, okay. So I'm not sure what the problem was before, but it's working now. Okay, perfect. So there's 5 so far. Okay. So I had some Thai food earlier across the street. It was pretty good. Not the best I've ever had, but it was pretty good. And so if you're looking for a change from the diner, okay. Okay, so we have our first question. I didn't know how to answer the question about literature and ideology, so may I know what was the answer? Okay, so it is our friend Terry Eagleton, who is a Marxist critic, a British Marxist critic, who talks about literature and ideology, and in fact literature as a kind of ideology. So in what ways can literature, and specifically English literature, function as ideology? Okay, so he talks about how literature overtook religion in the 19th century. Religion was losing its force, its importance in the 19th century, and he says literature was perfect to sort of fulfill some of the same ideological tasks religion did. For example, how it makes people forget about class differences. What sorts of things would make working class, miserable people, what would prevent them from rebelling against their bourgeois masters? And according to Eagleton, the English literature was perfect because it was a poor man's classic, so it was very easily taught. They didn't have to learn Latin or Greek or anything like that. But also, it was able to promote certain ideas, promote nationalism. It worked as a sort of a unifying function. Like, hey, these guys, like Shakespeare, he's English just like you were. And in fact, he was not well off. He was kind of working class. Milton, he's English just like you were. Wordsworth, he was English just like you were. Look at what these great English men and women did before you, and sort of brings us all together. So in that sense, Eagleton argues that literature can and has functioned in an ideological manner by sort of functioning almost as a kind of religion. So I'm not sure if that is a satisfactory explanation, but it's the one I have right now. Okay, all right, so okay, next question. Are you going to give us a passage from Derrida? No. I might give you one term from Derrida, but we didn't spend anywhere nearly enough time on him, so I might have one term. So no, don't worry. Don't worry about Derrida too much. I might have one term on there, but one term among others. Okay, so I'm just looking at my laptop as well. Okay. Okay. Just gonna have some water. Okay, so while we're waiting for the next question, I'll talk a bit about the structure of the exam. It'll be very similar to the midterm, with a twist. So you'll have some terms. We didn't have as many terms in the second half of the semester as we did in the first half. So, but there will be, part one will be some vocabulary. Part two will give you some significant major passages, major statements, and I'll ask you to comment on them. So I'll give you a passage from someone, and I'll ask you, who does this come from? How is it important? And again, there should be no surprises. These are all the major important statements we've talked about in class at length. I'm not going to give you some footnote from Derrida or something like that. The twist, though, is that I will give you one more part, which will be a short answer, and I'll give you probably something like 4, maybe 5 questions, and I'll ask you to answer one of them. And that will be more, I'll ask you to synthesize what you know. So in other words, show me that you can make some connections. But they'll be very broad questions, so that if you've been paying attention for the most of the semester, you should be okay. Okay, we have another question. My classmate said that you're not going to focus on Edward Said. Is this true? I'm not sure who said that or who started this rumor, but that is not true. We did spend, I think, almost 2 classes on Said, so I will definitely ask you about him. The good news with Said is that there's not much terminology. I mean, the only one I can think of is Orientalism. But it might be a good idea to refresh your memory with some of the major statements he's made. What does he mean by Orientalism? And I might ask you, or it's a good thing to think about what are some of the connections you can make between Orientalism, post-colonialism, and, for instance, Marxism. What are the connections between these two schools of thought? But there's not much, apart from Orientalism itself, there's not much vocab I can think of from Said. And Said's easy too. He's fun and he's easy. Okay. Maybe I'll put a filter. I like this one. Oh, okay, let's see here. Nobody likes him, Said. It's interesting. Said has his groupies, he has his fans, people that worship him and think he's awesome. I don't know if this is as true as it was 20 years ago, but when he was still alive, I mean, he would fill an auditorium like it was nobody's business. He even came to York University in Toronto, where I eventually studied, and the auditorium was packed. However, he has his detractors, he has his enemies, people like Bernard Lewis. He had famous rivalries with them. So needless to say, he's a polarizing figure. Some people love him, some people really don't like him. If you don't like him, I'd be curious to know why, particularly as people from the Middle East. I would be especially intrigued. I'd be especially intrigued to hear from you on that. Okay, Shema asks, interpretive communities, we should know that the ability to interpret is a constitutive of human beings, and that the ability, strategy. Okay, it's a bit muddled, but I think I know what you're getting at. Yes, so interpretive communities, the point Fish is trying to make is that we don't simply read a text, whatever text that is. He has fiction and poetry in mind, but we never simply read a text. We are all part of interpretive communities, so we bring assumptions and strategies with us to a text. And in some sense, we interpret a text before we've read it, not after we've read it. So yes, in that sense, interpretive communities, if you want to put it that way, constitute readers. You could put it that way. Readers are, of course, constructed. Yes, we do this thing called reading, but we do it differently. Different cultures do it differently. Different genders and people of different ages do it differently. So I think a lot of you like the example I gave, of the extreme example I gave of the African tribesmen interpreting Hamlet, focusing on things that wouldn't really interest us, right? So they're part of a very different interpretive community than we are. And even when I say we here in, let's say, Kuwait, we might be part of the same or even different interpretive communities at the same time. But the point is, yeah, we bring these assumptions and strategies with us, and we never simply read a text. So in a sense, readers construct text too. You can see a connection here with Roland Barthes. Okay, my first like. I can't believe it took nearly 15 minutes, but there it is. Okay, so next question. Okay, I'm not getting any emails, so I'll take that as a good sign. I think I may have a couple of lurkers, and that's okay. As long as you hit that like button. Two likes, okay. Okay, I'm not sure why it's a little fuzzy that way. All right, so let me, 8mm, I like this one. Okay. Okay. Ula asks, how does Mulvey use psychoanalysis as a political tool? Okay, that's a good question. So Laura Mulvey, why don't I change this back? Laura Mulvey, of course, wrote the essay on visual pleasure and narrative cinema, The Male Gaze, that essay. And she tells us outright that she's using psychoanalysis as a political tool. So this is significant for a couple of reasons. One, keep in mind this was the mid-1970s, and many people, including feminists and non-feminists alike, viewed psychoanalysis as very phallocentric, very male-dominated, male-oriented, right? So Freud kind of viewed women as sort of secondary or aberrant gender or sex compared to men. And so for a feminist to use psychoanalysis for a feminist agenda, for a feminist purpose, was unusual at the time. So what she does is she takes psychoanalysis and kind of turns it on its head, and she says, okay, let's take this phallocentric, this sort of masculine discourse, and see if we can actually use it for feminist purposes. So she combines psychoanalysis and feminism. She uses the tools of psychoanalysis to, in her own words, and I'm paraphrasing here, she unmasks the unconscious of narrative cinema. Okay, so in other words, let's use psychoanalysis to see if there's an unconscious in film. And so she unmasks what she discovers something she terms the male gaze that she thinks characterizes especially movies of the 1950s and 60s, the sort of silver screen, the golden age of cinema. And so in that sense, she's using psychoanalysis combined with feminism to interpret narrative cinema and to unmask its sort of masculine or patriarchal unconscious. That's the term she uses, I think. Okay, what's the difference between, another question, what's the difference between nostalgic and historical films? I get the nostalgic one and the Star Wars, but what about the historical part? What should we write? Sorry, I got confused because I saw a few messages at once. It's really tough being a YouTube celebrity. Okay, so Jameson makes a famous distinction between the historical film and the nostalgic film, or the nostalgia film, okay? So a historical film is merely one that takes place in the past. So something like Ben-Hur maybe, or I'm not sure what would be an even better example. Maybe Spartacus or something like that. Although, yeah, that's kind of historical. But a nostalgia film is one that, even if it takes place in the past, and it need not take place in the past because Star Wars doesn't, but it nevertheless, its primary appeal, I guess, is nostalgic because it is a pastiche of previous forms and previous styles. Okay, so to give the example of Star Wars, it is a pastiche, among other things, of cartoons kids grew up watching in the 1960s. It's not a parody of them, it's a pastiche of them. A historical film wouldn't have this. A historical film would just, according to Jameson, would be merely historical. Okay, so if now you can have a historical film that's nostalgic as well, but you can, according to Jameson, have a historic film that's just sort of purely historical. That does not have pastiche. That to Jameson, I think, is the key distinction, is that a historical film does not use pastiche to entertain us. Okay. All right, so far some good thoughtful questions. I'm up to 5 likes. That's pretty good. Okay. Okay. Okay, so I'm just gonna walk around for a bit, and for those who don't know, show you around my office. There's my desk. Now we have a new question. What about Pierre? What concept do we have to know? Okay, I think question is about the only Pierre we read this half of the semester was Pierre Bayard, the author of How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read. There's not too much to know about him. I might give you, there's a postmodern work of mine I hope you like. Okay, it's called The Mirror. For Bayard, I think just if you keep in mind a couple of the terms that we talked about. So, for example, non-reading and the collective library, the distinction he makes between, was it location and content? He doesn't have a lot of terms. I might give you a passage from his book, which I guess you have to know, you have to have read to answer, despite the title of his book. Or maybe not. Maybe if you haven't read his book, you can answer it. But there's not too much you have to know. He's not a very rigorous thinker, and by no means the most important one we read. I just kind of gave him to you for fun. But if you can just keep in mind maybe the 1 or 2 key ideas, like location versus content and what a non-reading is, and if you can identify a passage of his, that's about it. But he's by no means the most important thinker we read. How about William James? That's a good question because we didn't read William James, the brother of Henry James, who was a late 19th century sort of semi-philosopher. He was into some weird stuff, a mystical thinker. I'm guessing you mean Jameson. I'll wait for some confirmation. So yeah, William James and Frederick Jameson, very different people, but both people nonetheless, and both thinkers. Okay. Display of some of the filters. Let's see here. Oh, okay, I see. William James, no? I think you mean William Jones. Okay, William Jones, who founded invented Indo-European linguistics, essentially. He invented Indo-European linguistics. No, I won't ask you to anything about him. I just thought we would read him as sort of an illustration of maybe something that Said's talking about. So an example actually of benign Orientalism. So if you want to remember him as an example of benign Orientalism, be my guest, but I won't quiz you on him. Okay. HFS, CFC, I think that looks like the guy from Slipknot, in which case, welcome. Can you explain more the distinction between content and location? Very simple distinction that Bayach makes. Content of a book is simply what's inside a book. Okay, so you pick up a book and you read it. You read the story, the characters, the imagery, and so on. That's the content. But what is more important for Bayach, according to Bayach, what is more important to a cultivated person who wants to talk about books is not so much the content, but the location of the book. In other words, the location of the book in our collective library. In other words, the location of the book in our culture. So what is its relation to our culture and to other books? Okay, so that's what he means by location. He doesn't mean the physical or actual location, but the location in relation, what is the relation of this book in relation to other books? What about Terry? Next question. Terry Eagleton, I talked about him a little bit at the beginning. He, of course, again, a Marxist critic from England who's still alive. With him, we didn't read that much of him, but just keep in mind, if you want to talk about him, keep in mind he is keen on talking about literature, how ideology works, and in particular he does two things. One, he historicizes the discipline of English literature, the discipline we're all studying, and which is not something that's natural or that just arose out of nowhere, that has a history and an ideological history, in fact. There's a reason, according to Eagleton, that English was and is still dominated by women. Why is it that it's mostly women who study English literature at the undergraduate level? And he's also interested in literature as ideology, how literature replaced religion in the 19th century, the ideological function of religion, the sort of pacifying, unifying force that religion had, he said, because religion was becoming less dominant, would be replaced by literature. So that's about it with Eagleton. Okay, next question. We must remember that Pastoral and Milton are interpretations, not facts in the public domain. How? Okay, so that comes from Stanley Fish, who tells us that the labels Pastoral and Milton are interpretations and not facts. So what he means by this is, okay, let's go to Pastoral. Who says that a poem is a pastoral poem? Okay, it might be Milton, and he does call Lycidas a pastoral elegy, or a pastoral monody, I think. But he's getting that term from something else, from somewhere else. So already we have Milton's interpretation of this poem because he called it a pastoral. He didn't call it a comedy. He didn't call it a lyric. He could have called it anything else. He could have just said it was anonymous and it has no genre. So by naming it, Milton has already interpreted it for us. But also when we call something a pastoral, let's say Milton didn't say this poem's a pastoral poem. If your professor, me or someone else, says this is a pastoral poem, that's not something in the poem itself. That is an interpretation someone else came up with that we follow. Okay, so in that sense, pastoral labels like that, they are already interpretations, they're not facts. They're not found in nature. A pastoral is not something that's found in nature, even though it's about nature. It is something that was invented, and it is a label that people have used in the past and still do to interpret. So even if a poet himself or herself says, my poem is a pastoral, that's already an interpretation. Do we have to be on a first-name basis with the writers? No, you don't, and in fact, this is something I find somewhat amusing here. I guess it's part of the culture that people often refer to first names. So people call me Mr. or Dr. Arby. They don't call me by my last name. If someone called me Dr. Arby in Canada, I would start laughing. It just sounds funny. But that's the convention here. So this convention in English literature, or in fact any other academic discipline, is to refer to authors and thinkers by their last names. So we wouldn't say Billy Aristotle, we would just say Aristotle, or Orwell says this, Orwell says that, Bart says this, not Roland. Okay, we're not buddies with these thinkers. In the same way that you wouldn't say, if you're writing about Shakespeare, you wouldn't say, Billy says this or William says that. You just say Shakespeare does this. So last names are more important. Okay, I might play with some more filters. Dawn, I like this one. I'm going to keep this one for now. I think one of my colleagues is having trouble staying on the stream, so he might not do very well in the exam. Another question. Another question. Disneyland represents the United States, and Jameson said that hyperreality is more real than real itself. How so? Okay, so first of all, it is Baudrillard who talks about the simulacra and the hyperreal and all that stuff, not Jameson. Although Jameson, like Baudrillard, is someone who talks about postmodernism. So what Baudrillard says essentially is that in a hyper-reality, which is what we live in, where he's not alive anymore, so I'm not sure if he thinks we will still be, we're still in one, but that in a hyper-real situation, hyper-real culture, or simply a hyper-reality, we are surrounded by these images or copies or representations of things that have become more real than the reality itself. Okay, so think about in our culture, and I think this is more true now than it was in the 1980s when he was writing, think about representations and imitations and images of things that don't correspond to a reality, and how that has sort of, as he says, it precedes or comes before the reality or takes the place of it. I was recently talking to one of my colleagues about how AUK itself is a simulacrum, maybe even a simulacrum of a simulacrum. So AUK is an American university, and I see, if you go to the diner, for example, you see all this Americana on the walls, and they're trying to create an American diner, quote unquote, but no American university I know of looks like that. Or think about images we get from cinema and TV of American colleges, American universities, right? What do they look like? What do the students do? They play guitar outside, they play hacky sack, right? In no other context do people play hacky sack except when they're on the campus grass. But that's something that they have gotten from movies, right? So in that sense, I think that AUK, if Baudrillard was alive today, he would say that AUK itself is kind of a simulacrum. So that a representation, or it's imitating something that doesn't really exist. Okay, Sharuk asks, Derrida, logocentrism, phonocentrism, deconstruction. If you can tell me in a sentence what deconstruction is, and you don't have to, but this might be one of the terms you get, that's fine. I might also have phonocentrism on there, which of course is the sort of historical privileging of speech over writing, binary opposition Derrida is very fond of talking about. But apart from that, I won't really ask you anything about Derrida, and I won't give you any passages from him. We didn't spend enough time on him. He's an author you have to spend a lot of time on and follow his reasoning, because he writes a lot. I mean, he'll write 50 pages on a single metaphor in Plato or something like that. So next time I teach this class, I'll definitely spend more time on him, but because we didn't have that luxury, I'm not going to expect you to know that much. However, if you want to, you're welcome to include him in your short answer at the end. But I won't expect you, I will not demand that you show me you know Derrida. Okay, all right, okay, 2 questions in a row. First question, what is Wittig anti-essentialism? Okay, so Monique Wittig is a feminist writer who happens to be a lesbian, writing in the early 1980s. So she's at the beginning of what we call third wave feminism, which we are in today. So in the 70s, when feminism had already been well established, de Beauvoir was writing in the 1940s, so by the 60s and 70s, you had women demanding equal rights and being able to wear pants. Believe it or not, that's something women couldn't do in America until the late 60s or early 1970s. So they won the right to wear pants, among other things, and you had you had some feminists who were essentialists, so they believed that there is something, there is a female essence, this irreducible core femininity, and that's okay. That's something that should be celebrated. So there are these, there are these core feminine qualities that women have and should celebrate. So, for example, that women are more nurturing and so on. So, but anti-essentialists, and most feminists today are anti-essentialists. I can't think of more than one famous feminist who's an essentialist today. Most are anti-essentialists. The anti-essentialists say, no, there is no such thing as a core, essential feminine identity. Male and female are, as Wittig says, political categories, political and economic categories, and we perform our gender. Okay, so in that sense, you can be whatever you want to be. Okay, so that you're not born. One is not born a woman. One becomes a woman. Likewise, one is not born a man. One becomes a man. Right. So these anti-essentialists argue that gender is much more fluid and socially constructed, essentially. Okay, a couple of more questions. How do we explain that the distinction between high and low culture is blurred? Okay, so this comes from Jameson, one of his now fairly widely accepted characterizations of postmodern culture, postmodern art, is that it blurs the distinction between high and low culture. So high culture is stuff like classical music and opera, art galleries, and low culture is pretty much everything else. So sitcoms and stand-up comedy is low culture. It's low art. Comic books, okay. But now the distinction between those two is a lot less stable than it used to be. So that in, I think it was the 1950s, Andy Warhol, famous modernist painter, photographer, painter, one of his famous works is a can of soup. Like literally, he designed a can of soup. And so that's a great example of dissolving the distinction between high art and low art, so that a painting of a can of soup is considered art. Likewise, someone in the class said comic books. Comic books were derided as, trash or, feeble entertainment as recently as 20 years ago, like even when I was a kid. And now it's considered, you can take university classes on comic books. There's one in Canada where I come from, the university I went to. Even 10 years ago, there was a professor, actually the one who taught me theory, he's teaching a course on comics and cartoons. So that would be impossible 30, 40, 50 years ago. So those are two good examples of the dissolution between, or the blurring of lines between high and low culture. Now, if you disagree with Jameson, that's totally fine. I think there are some problems with his definitions, but that's what he's talking about. All right, Sharuk asks, is the short answer question going to be open? Like, do we draw the connections ourselves, or will we be asked to draw connections between specific people? Yeah, the short answer will be fairly broad. So I'm not going to ask you to make connections between Wittig and Edward Said or something like that. But I might ask you, can you make connections between feminism, which itself is very broad as we've seen, and post-colonialism? Okay, that might be what one short answer question looks like. Are they going to be hard? Well, I think yes and no. I think I want to challenge you with them, but I don't think they will be hard. And I think that if you've been attending classes regularly, which 99% of you have, and you've been doing the readings, and you've been just thinking about some connections yourself, which we've been doing in class, by the way, as well, I don't think you'll have a problem. And I won't give you too many questions, because I know we don't have a lot of time. I wish we had more time. We only have an hour and 15 minutes, so I'm not going to expect you to give a long answer. I might just ask you for no more than a paragraph. But I think they'll be broad enough so that even if you don't know Wittig that well, or you don't know Said that well, you can still pick one of the questions and give a satisfactory answer. But I think of this more as a chance to show me what connections you can make, how you can kind of combine and bring together the stuff we've been reading for the last 4 months. Let's see. Who is the least important thinker we looked at this time? Interesting. I would say, by least important, in terms of influence or anything like that, it would have to be Bayard, the last guy we read. I partly gave him to you for fun. I just thought it would be a neat way to conclude this semester. Bayard, though, is not... I don't think he's going to change your life, and he's not considered a major theorist, at least not as far as I know. And his book was also pretty recent. But I think that if I had to pick one, it would be Bayard, as far as who is the least important, if you had to pick one. Are we going to have some bonus questions? Interesting. One thing that never ceases to amaze me is that I often get more... The one question I always get is, do we get bonus questions, or do we get extra credit questions? Do we have extra credit assignments? So, but as far as this question goes, you might have a bonus question, and in that case, yeah, I'm not sure what else to say, but yeah, you may have one bonus question. But a bonus question, of course, will only be one question. It's not going to be worth half the exam or anything like that. Okay. Okay. Okay, I got a laugh emoji. Okay, great. And then I have from Bahcha, can you elaborate on northern statement? So I'm just laughing because it's an unusual name even for a Canadian, an Anglophone Canadian. His name was Northrup Fry, just the last name Fry, F-R-Y-E is fine. And he made this statement, we can't learn literature. And it's a mind-boggling statement, and certainly was the first time I read it, and it took me a long time to figure it out. But this ties into what we were talking about earlier when we were talking about pastoral, how pastoral, quote-unquote pastoral, is itself an interpretation. It's not a fact. So I connect that to Fry when he says we can't learn literature because, and one day you guys, some of you will teach literature, and I think that day you'll understand what he means. That when we're talking about, let's say, a poem or a work of fiction, we are talking about interpretations and criticism of, let's say, a poem. We're not talking about the poem itself. When we say that this poem is written in iambic pentameter, that's something someone else made up. When we say that this is a pastoral elegy, that's something someone made up. When we say that this narrator is a naive or unreliable narrator, that's something a critic 50 years ago made up, right? So we're talking about interpretations of other people's interpretations and other people's sort of criticisms about a work of art. Fry would later say that the arts don't speak, they're dumb, they can't speak. Art history is the same. This art history might even be a better example for those of you who are taking an art history class, and if you are, you can impress your professor with this and say that we can't learn art. We are talking about the criticism and the interpretation of art history. So what have other people said about art? You can't talk about art itself. I hope that answers your question. Okay, Khadija asks, how is literature connected to religious, according to Eagleton? Well, Eagleton, the connection he makes is, now remember, he's talking about a specific point in history, in 19th century, late 19th century England. And this was a time when science was becoming more dominant. You know, think of Darwin, think of Charles Lyell, the guy who discovered the different layers of the earth, and we discovered that the earth is much older than we thought it was. So this was a time when religion was becoming less dominant in Victorian society. And he said, and religion itself, among other things, does serve an ideological function. It tells people sort of their place in society. So for example, if you are in the Christian tradition, if you are a poor working class person, if you're a slave or a serf, you are sort of, you internalize the idea that one day in the afterlife, it'll all get better. And so that's what prevents you from starting a revolution. That's what someone like Eagleton would say. So he said, but religion was becoming a lot less dominant, but he said literature, and especially English literature, would sort of take over, and it was a perfect replacement for that ideological function that religion had in the 19th century. So that, for instance, literature, which was being taught in schools, and remember also that public education was still very new at the time. For a long time, most people weren't educated, but they were beginning to get educated then. So this was a perfect replacement, and this sort of taught people their place in society, and it taught them to sort of love the country they come from, because Shakespeare was English just like they were, and it also taught them to sort of not think about the class differences, to focus on these quote-unquote timeless beauties and things like that in literature, which will kind of make them forget how crappy their life is. So that's the connection Eagleton makes. So he kind of says that literature replaced the religion, the ideological function of religion in Victorian England. Okay, you're welcome. Okay, I've gotten some thoughtful questions so far. We've been going for 45 minutes. Let's see if any more come in. Okay, I'll just play with the filters here. Let's see. 8mm. I think this is my favorite one. Makes me look like I'm from a documentary in the 70s or something like that. Okay, another question. What about historicizing English discipline? Okay. 1 second. Okay. Yes, so that's something else Eagleton does. And so Eagleton talks about English literature and how it replaced the ideological function left by religion because it was becoming less dominant. But he talks about the rise of English literature as a discipline. English literature had been around, of course, since at least since Beowulf, since Chaucer and so on. But the study of English literature is surprisingly recent. And so Eagleton traces its origins in late 19th century England. And by historicizing it, in other words, by looking at it not as something that is just there, something that's natural. He puts it in the historical context, and by showing that it has a history, shows the ideological forces that gave rise to it. Foucault does this as well, even though he's not a Marxist. Foucault considers himself a historian of the present. So he takes these things like sexuality that we think are just there, they're normal, they're natural, and he talks about how no, these things have a history, and by exposing the history, how these things were created in history, they are not timeless, universal, natural givens. They have a history, and they often have some ideological foundation. And that partly explains why, among other things, the association between sort of women and the study of English literature, which is not a coincidence. That's something that's still with us. You even think today what the dominant ideology tells us about English literature. You know, we talked about the baristas and all that, which is not true at all, by the way. But this idea is a very powerful and very persistent one, that English majors end up working as baristas. So think about it. Where does that idea come from? Why is that still there? Okay, 48 minutes almost. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, this is another filter. This is the docu filter. This is pretty good too, actually. Okay, I might stick around for another couple of minutes. If I don't get any other questions, I'll assume that you guys know everything. Just a heads up, by the way, there should be no surprises with the exam, but I will insist tomorrow that people, and we have enough room for this, that people sort of sit by themselves, so people aren't clustered together or anything like that. So I'd like there to be a space between each student. Okay. Okay, we're approaching 50 minutes. Said essentialized, okay, I have another question, or actually it's more like a statement. Said essentialized the Orient. Sure, if you want to say that. I think what you're going for is, yes, one thing, and it's important not to oversimplify Said. It's very easy to do that. It's very easy to do that with a lot of the thinkers we've looked at, but in particular Said. Yes, he talks about Western stereotypes of the Orient, but it's more complicated and more interesting than that. One thing he says that Orientalism as a discourse does is that it essentializes the Orient. So remember that in this class, all the thinkers we've looked at, Wittig and so on, they're very skeptical of any essentialism. Okay, so if there is in the case of feminism, a feminine essence, for instance. However, he says that Orientalism as a discourse essentializes the Orient, gives the Orient and Oriental people these essentialist qualities, right? So, for example, that the Oriental, the Arab, or anything like that is essentially violent or is essentially irrational or emotional, something like that, right? And so what happens when you essentialize entire groups of people, right? So that's one thing Orientalism did as a discourse, is it essentializes people, it essentializes cultures. And by essentializing them also kind of makes them timeless or frozen in time. So you can see some connections between Orientalism, post-colonialism, and feminism, for example. How is feminism, or how can feminism act as a political tool? Oh yeah, well, you could have an entire class on that statement. Feminism, of course, is maybe something we didn't talk about enough, is the struggle, the struggle for the political rights of women, equality for women. That's how it started. But later, and it still is, many people, many feminists and even non-feminists today would say that we still need feminism because these inequalities still persist, but they're just less obvious than they were 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So feminism is still engaged in that struggle, but a feminist will, whether they're using psychoanalysis or some other tool, will try to problematize these universal or natural things. So some of them will problematize even distinctions like man and woman. So Wittig, for example, says no, woman and man are political categories. These are not natural things. They don't exist. They're socially constructed. Okay, or Mulvey looks at cinema in general, not a particular movie, but cinema in general, and she critiques it from a feminist perspective to try to unmask the patriarchal or phallocentric ideology underneath, or the sort of the masculine unconscious of cinema. So that's something. So feminist analyses, feminist criticisms, it can take many different forms. This is why I said that even if I got 5 feminist interpretations of Aladdin from you guys, they would all probably look quite different, and some of them might even contradict each other. So it can, but the core thing they share is that feminism, feminist theory tries to unmask the patriarchal ideology or unconscious of either a single text or a group of texts. That's one thing that they do. They also, something we didn't talk about much, they also try to restore women writers who may have been neglected by the canon, and that's something that we are doing these days. We read more female writers in literature classes than we were doing 40 years ago, and that's thanks largely in part to the feminist movement. So they do have different methods, but they're all trying to achieve the same thing. Okay, we're running on 55 minutes almost. Okay, I'll change the filter maybe one more time. Silver screen, this is very appropriate given what we were just talking about. A very interesting question, by the way, for the final paper, some of you guys are writing about this, is the male gaze. Does the male gaze still exist today? Mulvey's essay was written over 40 years ago, and she herself thinks that the culture and cinema has changed a lot, so that there is no male gaze anymore, really. Other people aren't so sure. They think, no, there still is something like a male gaze, it's just less obvious. Another question is there such thing as a female gaze? Some people talk about that. But is there such thing as a female gaze? And more importantly, is something like a female gaze even possible? Think about the things that are necessary, the economic and ideological assumptions that are necessary for something like that to happen. So these are some interesting questions if you're shopping around for a topic for the final paper, and if you still haven't decided on one. Okay, I'm just going to check my messages here. Okay. Can you please not make it difficult? I'm not sure how to answer that except to say that the midterm was, I think you guys totally nailed the midterm, and this one will look very similar. It'll have a bit of a twist, but nothing, assuming you've been doing the readings and coming to class most of the time, nothing on the exam should come as a surprise to you. Absolutely nothing should be surprising to you, because even though it seems like we've read a lot in this class, we actually haven't. I mean, we've only read something like 9 thinkers, 9 theorists over the last few weeks, and some of them, like Fish or Bayard or Eagleton, we read maybe 5 or 6 pages of them, right? And some of them are more important than others. Okay, so people like Marx and Althusser are huge, and some like Bayard is, if you never think about him again, it's fine, right? So I think nothing should come as a surprise. Have mercy on us, I am so scared. I'm not sure why you guys are acting scared. Like I said, this is, you guys nailed the midterm, and in fact, I was pleasantly surprised by the results. So this will be very similar. Shema asks, are we going to have many options to choose from in the passages section? Depends on your definition of many and what your definition of choose is. Is it going to be less than the midterm? To be honest, I don't remember off the top of my head, but it will be very similar. So you'll have enough choice. I'm not going to force you to answer a question. You should have enough choice. You'll probably have less vocabulary, but probably a similar number of passages, and I'll give you maybe something like 4 4 short answer questions, and you'll choose one of those. So and give me an answer in a few sentences or a paragraph. You don't have that much time, so as long as it looks like you've done more than just memorized a few definitions, and I think you guys should be fine. Most of you have been attending every single class, and you've been doing the readings and paying attention and asking questions. So, and I'll say this again, and I'm drawing on my own experience here. When I wrote my comprehensive exam for theory, when I was doing my PhD, I had to study a bunch of theory for a few months and write a 4-hour exam at the end of 4 months. I was terrified as well, but then someone told me this and I realized it's true. Once you sit down to write the exam, you know more than you think you do. You really do. And it'll come back to you. Of course, if you haven't been coming to class or been doing the readings, then I can't really help you. But if you have been attending class most of the time and doing the readings, which most of you have, if not all of you, you'll know more than you think you do. Okay, we're approaching 1 hour. Okay, so I'll keep this open for another couple of minutes maybe. Sharuk writes, we might know more than we think, but we do. But that could be less than what you think we know. Okay, it's getting very philosophical. But trust me, you know more than you think you do. That is my message to you, my uplifting message to you. Okay, thank you, Professor. Okay, great. Filters and all, thank you. I was very impressed that I finally discovered the filters. So that's my innovation for this time. So I'm glad you found it helpful. And to be honest, I find it fun talking about theory, believe it or not, outside of class. This is the kind of stuff that my colleagues and I talk about sometimes. Okay. Okay, yeah, okay, you're welcome. I'm glad you found it helpful. I'll see you two tomorrow. Ready to write your exam. Okay, any final thoughts, any final questions? I'm surprised I haven't gotten any of the sort of random or silly questions that we got last time. Maybe it's the fact that the semester's been so long for everyone. Okay, I might keep this open for another 2 minutes. And if I don't hear anything, I'll let you guys go. Get a good night's rest, and see you tomorrow. Okay. Just gonna see if anyone's outside. I hear some rustling outside my door. Oh, that's Raymond. He's still here. We're just about done. So yeah, we've been going for about an hour. I think people are starting to check out. Do you have any advice or thoughts for the my 415 class?
Good luck. Listen to what Professor Arby says. I was just listening to the one from November about the good explanation between diachronic and synchronic. So I'm sure the explanations are probably very succinct, and so wish you good luck.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Raymond. Okay, so I think we're done for this installment. There's my door, as you guys can tell. So as I said, if you've been doing the readings and showing up to class, you know more than you think you do. Get a good night's rest. Nothing on the exam should come as a surprise to you guys. You guys can do this, okay? So I'll see you guys tomorrow.